Hello. The topic of this lecture is David Hume's Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. David Hume is one of the most important philosophers ever to have written in English. He's certainly very crucial to this course. We'll be reading some Hume in each of the units of the course. And this is not because I decided we've got to read Hume in every unit of the course. It's that he's made so many important contributions to philosophy in all areas that it would just be really hard to address any major question without, in some sense, skirting across some very important contribution of Hume's. Hume himself was a Scotsman, a member of the what's known as the Scottish Enlightenment. This is a period of time where there's just a number of immensely talented people sort of living all at about the same time and all about the same place. And Hume, of course, is one of the brightest lights of the Scottish Enlightenment. I'd encourage you to look it up. You can read about a lot of the folks involved with the Scottish Enlightenment, including a friend of Hume's, a guy named Adam Smith, who wrote a very important book called The Wealth of Nations that basically invented economics as a field. There are, plenty of novelists and playwrights, people of all kinds, inventors like James Watt, the inventor of the steam engine, is often associated with this Scottish Enlightenment. Um, but Hume is the figure we're taking a look at here. You'll see this is an image of Hume. It's one of a couple of famous images of Hume, famous paintings of him. One is a painting of him as a much younger man. He's sort of wearing a sort of head wrap in that one. You can doubtless find it if you search for the image. This is probably the more famous of the two. This is Hume as an older fellow, and after he did reasonably well for himself economically in his later years. He was from a decent family. They weren't rich, but they were fairly well connected. He went to university at the University of Edinburgh. It's where he decided to study philosophy. Initially, his family wanted him to study law, but he found it's just unutterably boring and ended up deciding to devote himself to a study of philosophy and of the classics. Um, and it's a good thing too. I'm not sure that he would have made quite as many important contributions to jurisprudence as he has made to philosophy. He went to university at a bit of an early age. When his older brother went to university at Edinburgh. Hume followed along at age something like 10 or 11 because his family recognized that he was pretty precocious. He was an avid reader, certainly by that time. It was a very bright young man. People saw his potential from a rather early age. In fact, if you want to study Hume these days, the University of Edinburgh is still pretty much the best place to go. They've got a really excellent Hume library, and at any given time, one or two of the top Hume scholars in the world are generally working there at the University of Edinburgh. In fact, if you want to play sort of a 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon style game with David Hume, the chain from the University of Edinburgh to yourselves isn't in fact all that long. For example, the person that taught me Hume when I was in graduate school himself went to the University of Edinburgh, and so now here I'm introducing you to David Hume as well. So like I told you, it's not a very long chain. In any case, Hume's major philosophical works include a treatise of human nature, which he wrote when he was pretty young. He started it when he was in his early 20s, and took him several years to finish it. But once it was finished, it was published. And in Hume's autobiography, he says, in his own words, he says it fell dead born from the press, right? As in, he was a little bit devastated by the lack of response it got. And I think to some extent he overstates the lack of response that it got, but certainly not a lot of people read it. It's a very big book. It's very innovative, right? And so sometimes people don't recognize quite how good something is until some hindsight gets to tell them that boy, that was really ahead of its time. And that's certainly the case with Hume's treatise of human nature. Really, if you any really serious Hume scholar is going to spend most of their time really going through the treatise. It's a really excellent work, but again, it's very large. Um, Later in his career, he sort of bounced from job to job. He had a number of tasks, and He was most productive when he worked as essentially a librarian, and he was able to use the library's resources to write some really excellent works. One of his non-philosophical works that he's very famous for is he wrote a history of Great Britain that was a good seller for about 2 centuries. I mean, it gave him the kind of financial independence that he really allowed him to do many other things in his later years. But one of the things that he worked on after the Treatise of Human Nature didn't quite have the reception that he wanted was he decided to publish it in smaller pieces and sort of polish it up and revisit some of the topics of the treatise and really sort of focus certain of those topics, publish them in smaller pieces. And some of those smaller pieces are referred to as the Enquiries, specifically the Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, which is a bit from what we're reading here, and then the Enquiry Concerning the Principles of Morals. That was published in 1751. And he continued to write some other things and publish correspondences and essays, and he was certainly a well-known intellectual of his time. And his last major work was arranged. It was written much earlier in his life, but he arranged to have it published after his death. It's the Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. Throughout his life, he had had some trouble being denied employment, or in some cases being fired from various jobs for essentially being an atheist, right? In his day and age, that wasn't really the done thing. He did certainly face a lot of a social pressure over that, and so really just didn't want to deal with any of the blowback from his dialogues concerning natural religion, which are frankly as excellent a piece of writing as anything ever really has been. They're very thought provoking, and again, because they were written before Mickey Mouse existed, they're now completely free. You can read them anywhere, anytime you like. Just you Google it, and you can get probably 4 different edits and into modern language. But even the original language is really excellent. Hume is a master of English style. So if you ever really want to see a good example of English style, just pick up anything written by Hume. The guy can seriously write. Right. So in front of us today, we have a piece from his Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. Right. Again, the Enquiries are these published essays that are a little more polished, a little bit more tailored toward the layperson than the Treatise of Human Nature was, and they focus on a sort of smaller number of topics than the Treatise of Human Nature did. And so right off the bat, you see Hume draw a very interesting distinction, right in the first sentence in the first paragraph of his piece. He says that all the objects of human reason are one of 2 kinds of things. One of those kinds of things he calls relations of ideas. The other of those kinds of things he calls matters of fact. And I think the names he selected for these things are pretty descriptive, but let's go ahead and spell them out anyway. Again, a direct quote from Hume says relations of ideas, right, are described this way. He says, propositions of this kind can be discovered purely by thinking, with no need to attend to anything that actually exists anywhere in the universe. The truths that Euclid demonstrated would still be certain and self-evident, even if there never were a circle or triangle in nature. Right? So that's why they're called relations of ideas, right? They're the sort of thing that you get by simply thinking, just pure thought, right? Matters of fact are the other objects of human reason, the other kinds of things that we can think about. And he points out that these are not established in the same way, and we cannot have such strong grounds for thinking them true. The contrary of every matter of fact is still possible because it doesn't imply a contradiction, and is conceived by the mind as easily and clearly as if it conformed perfectly to reality. That the sun will not rise tomorrow is just as intelligible as, and no more contradictory than, the proposition that the sun will rise tomorrow. So if you think to earlier in the course, when we talked about the differences between contingent sentences, tautologies, contradictions, what he's pointing out here is that relations of ideas very often take the form of tautologies, or at least when you deny some of these things, then you end up with contradictions. Consider the claim that triangles have 3 angles or something like that. These sorts of things are necessarily true, right? Denying that a triangle has 3 angles is to say something that's, in a sense, nonsense, and it must be false. But matters of fact are different, right? If I say, the Sears Tower is taller than the Willis Tower, or the Willis Tower is taller than the Sears Tower. Neither one of those things are contradictions. Those are both just statements about the way the world is, however that might be. And that's why they're called simply matters of fact. They however the world is what determines the truth of these things. And so you can say that the sun will rise tomorrow, or you can say the sun will not rise tomorrow. Again, both of those things, it's a matter of fact whether it does or not. The thing is, neither of those is a contradiction. There's nothing about pure thought that lets us settle any of those kinds of questions. And so for Hume, these are the two kinds of things that people can think about. They can think about the sorts of things that rely on pure thought alone. Oh, and we can also think about the things that require some checking, some experience to come to grips with. There's an extra set of terminology here that Hume does not really bother to define because the terms are reasonably common in philosophical literature, but this is the first time you will have seen them in this course, and you'll see them again here and there. So the terms are a priori and a posteriori, and so let's talk about the term a priori first. Now, the first thing I want you to notice about this is that the phrase a priori, it's a whole phrase, right? That a that's at the beginning there is not the English a, right? It's not the English article at all, right? The whole phrase a priori is Latin, or sort of corrupt medieval Latin. It doesn't, as far as I know, have a translation that really says what it actually means. So yeah, it's a whole phrase. It's not referring to a thing called a priori, right? That's not what's going on here. It's a priori. The Latin word a means sort of by or of or something like that, or from sometimes. It's a pretty versatile propositional phrase. So in any case, this term a priori refers to something that is discovered purely by thinking and without experience. So relations of ideas, by their nature, are all discovered a priori. So you can say a priori, you can say a priori, it doesn't matter. It's a corruption of a dead language. So those are both pronunciations that are, reasonable, and I've heard people say either of those. So that's what an a priori thought is, or an a priori thing. Or it means to when you're talking about thinking a priori, you're thinking about thinking without resort to experience. The sort of contrary to a priori is a posteriori, right, or a posteriori. It's discovered, that refers to something that's discovered only through experience, right? So matters of fact are all a posteriori matters, right? They're the things that are discovered only through experience, right? And so Hume will use these terms here and there, and some authors later in the course will use these terms here and there. So it's worth knowing them, and knowing them well, and knowing how they apply. So Hume here presents us with a very important question in the very early in the piece. He says it this way. He says, "What sorts of grounds do we have for being sure of matters of fact, propositions about what exists and what is the case, that aren't attested by our present senses or the records of our memory? It's a notable fact that neither ancient philosophers nor modern ones have attended much to this important question. So investigating it, I shall be marching through difficult terrain with no guides or signposts. And that may help to excuse any errors I commit or doubts that I raise. Those errors and doubts may even be useful. They may make people curious and eager to learn, and may destroy that ungrounded and unexamined confidence that people have in their opinions, a confidence that is the curse of all reasoning and free inquiry." And so what does he mean when he talks about getting beyond our senses and our memory? Right? Surely, if we're looking at various matters of fact, these are things that all, again, they're a posteriori things. They require experience to say something about or to know something about. But of course, we have all kinds of beliefs about matters of fact that are, in fact, beyond our senses and memory. And here's the sorts of things he means. Right? So, for example, tomorrow. right? He uses the example himself, whether the sun will rise, okay? We have all kinds of beliefs about tomorrow, including about whether the sun will rise. We have beliefs about what it will be like. We have beliefs about what will happen. We have beliefs about roughly how things will go. And all of those beliefs, those are all matters of fact. Whether the sun comes up, what the breakfast is going to taste like, whether, our workplace will look the same as the last time we saw it, all those sorts of things. We have all kinds of beliefs that are simply matters of fact. But notice they're beyond our experience. Right, everything about tomorrow is not something that we have experienced yet. Right, we've not been there. It's still to come. And so all of our beliefs about the future are examples of beliefs that we have that are beyond our senses and memory, and we have a great many of them. Likewise, we have beliefs about whole categories of things. For example, if I asked everyone, "Do you like apples?" Right, someone says, "Yes, I like apples." Notice what you're saying is you're saying something about all apples, right? You're saying all apples are such that you would like them if you ate them. But of course, you've not had all the apples, and I know that because I've had at least some. And so notice your belief about what apples are like includes the apples you have had experience with and all of the apples you haven't. And of course, you have no experience with the vast, vast, vast majority of apples that there are or have ever been. Same things with other kinds of categories. Here you see pictured a McDonald's cheeseburger, which honestly, if I was going to pick a picture of a cheeseburger, I would have probably, if the point was just to pick a picture of a cheeseburger, I would have picked a better cheeseburger. But my point here is that we have beliefs about what McDonald's cheeseburgers are like, pretty much no matter where or when we get them, because they are so, generally uniform, right? It's another belief that we have about them. So for example, you know that if you get a McDonald's hamburger, the pickles on it are going to be hot, right? Not hot in the sense of spicy, right? But like hot in terms of temperature, which is weird and sort of wrong, right? For a hamburger, right? The cold stuff should be cold and the hot stuff should be hot. And, pickles are refrigerated. They're cold things. And so they shouldn't, it messes with me every time. But these are beliefs that I have about McDonald's cheeseburgers, that the pickles on them will be hot, and they'll be hot on every McDonald's cheeseburger. But of course, I don't have experience with every McDonald's cheeseburger, but I do have beliefs about every McDonald's cheeseburger. So you can see between beliefs about categories of things and beliefs about the future, we have many, 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 many beliefs about things that go beyond our experience. And notice many of those, the vast majority of those beliefs are of matters of fact, not of relations of ideas. They're not the sorts of things that we gain a priori, the things that we gain through pure thought. They would only be gained through experience, yet we have these beliefs about things of which we have no experience, right? So that's a bit of a puzzle, and this is the puzzle that Hume wants to sort of start with. And he wants to try and explain how it is we come by such beliefs. His answer to this puzzle is to note that all of our beliefs, he puts it this way, he says all reasonings about matters of fact seem to be based on the relation of cause and effect, which is the only relation that can take us beyond the evidence of our memory and senses. We suppose that the present fact is connected with the one that we infer from it. If there were nothing to bind the two facts together, the inference from one to the other would be utterly shaky. So if we want to understand the basis of our confidence about matters of fact, we must find out how we come to know about cause and effect. And so what he's doing here is he's saying, look, the reason we have such beliefs, if we want to use the example of the sun rising tomorrow, the reason we have the belief about the sun rising tomorrow is because we think that there's some kind of natural law. Right? We think that there's a kind of cause and effect going on here, that the thing that causes the sun to rise, that is the rotation of the earth, is going to continue, right? And has no reason not to continue. And so if it continues, will simply cause yet another sunrise tomorrow and one the day after that, etc. And so you can see how this idea of cause and effect can lead you to have, based on past experience, ideas about future experience. Likewise, we can say that there's a set of procedures, right? There's a supply chain, and there's these procedures in which McDonald's cooks are trained, and that tends to make everything uniform, right? There's a sort of cause that was operating yesterday, and we assume will operate tomorrow. And so if all of the causes remain uniform, then all of the effects should remain uniform. And so this is according to Hume how we get these beliefs about stuff we don't have any experience with. He thinks we base it on what we do have experience with, and we think that whatever rules that caused the observations we made in the past will continue to operate and then cause what we should see in the future. But of course, this just pushes the problem back a little bit. The idea is that now we want to know where do we get this idea of cause and effect? What kind of an idea is it? Is it one of these relations of ideas that is discovered a priori? Or is it one of these matters of fact that's discovered a posteriori? Now think carefully, right? See if you can, you can anticipate. Of course, Hume is very clear about what he thinks. He puts it this way. He says, present an object to a man whose skill and intelligence are as great as you like. If the object is of a kind that is entirely new to him, no amount of studying of its perceptible qualities, that is the things you can see or feel or touch, will enable him to discover any of its causes or effects. And he gives an example. Adam, if his reasoning abilities were perfect from the start, couldn't have inferred from the fluidity and transparency of water that it could drown him, or from the light and warmth of fire that it could burn him. So clearly, Hume believes that our idea of cause and effect, or our idea of these, the beliefs we have beyond our senses and memory, does not come from a priori reasoning. It's not a relation of ideas. Instead, it's a kind of matter of fact. It comes a posteriori and can only come with experience. And he gives a lot of evidence for this, right? He gives a lot of examples in this portion of the essay. Here's just one, right? He says, if we are asked to say what the effects will be of some object without consulting past experience of it, how can the mind go about doing this? It must invent or imagine some event as being the object's cause, and clearly this invention must be entirely arbitrary. The mind can't possibly find the effect in the supposed cause, however carefully we examine it, for the effect is totally different from the cause, and therefore can never be discovered in it. A stone raised into the air and left without any support immediately falls. But if we consider the situation a priori, we shall find nothing that generates the idea of a downward rather than an upward or some other motion in the stone. So he presents a fairly powerful thought experiment here. He says, imagine something you've seen, a million times, right? It's just an object left to fall. So if I hold out a stone and then let it go, you very much expect, because you've seen something like this, again, a million times, that the stone will simply fall. But again, imagine you just popped into existence, right, the moment before I let the stone go. Do you have any reason to assume anything about what will happen? Right? Couldn't the stone go straight up or sideways or any other direction, as Hume says? And that seems reasonable. It seems like without the kind of experience that we get, we can't just by pure thought decide what things will do. It's only because we're used to it, that we have lots of experience of things, that we build up this notion of cause and effect. So the notion of cause and effect is a posteriori. It's a matter of fact. It's not a relation of ideas and can't be gotten at by pure reason alone. But of course, this raises a new question. What kind of experience is this? Because of course, he himself points out, Hume does, that our senses don't directly reveal causes and effects, right? That causes and effects are separate, and we don't see them, we don't hear them, we don't feel them. Right? We just sort of infer them from other things that we see and feel and touch, etc. So consider an example that's very similar to one that, well, pretty much is the example that Hume uses here. So here's just a standard billiard ball. It's the cue ball, right? That's the one that you are supposed to strike and send toward the other balls. Now I'm going to ask you to imagine that you haven't seen a billiard ball hit each other, but you've probably seen it hundreds of times. But the idea is just to think of just a billiard ball. When you examine it, you should pay attention to what your senses tell you and what they don't. That's one of the things that's really great and really insightful about Hume, is that he doesn't get carried away in making assumptions here. He pays very close attention to what his senses really do get him and what they don't get him. So looking at this cue ball, imagine, picking it up, imagine feeling it, imagine, sort of like putting it next to your ears, seeing if it makes a sound, imagine looking very carefully, and all that stuff. Is there anything in any of your sensory experience with this cue ball that is going to show you what its causes are or what its effects are? Right? No, you just see the roundness and the whiteness and the smoothness and the hardness, etc. That's all you get, is just what your senses tell you in the moment. They don't, causes don't look like anything or sound like anything, neither do effects. And so now imagine we put the ball in motion. Right? This is how you draw motion on a stationary object. You should have seen this on the whiteboard. This is even more impressive. So again, just imagine the billiard ball is in motion, and you're aware of nothing else but the billiard ball in motion. Well, what then? Do you see any causes? Do you see any effects? Or do you simply see a ball in motion? Well, again, causes don't look like anything. They don't sound like anything. They don't smell like anything, etc. So, in fact, this is one of the central insights of Newton. You say, well, look, if it's in motion, something must have caused it. And Newton is the one to point out that that's not so. And honestly, when you think about it, there's all kinds of things that are in motion in the universe that are simply perpetually in motion. That's just the way they are. Motion is a stable state of matter, just like rest. That is, motion doesn't all by itself require any explanation. It doesn't even require a cause. And certainly, just a ball in motion doesn't show you any causes or any effects. Now imagine that this billiard ball is moving in a straight line towards another billiard ball. Okay, this is again very familiar, but I'm going to ask you to suspend that for a second, to think about, what if you just popped into existence, only a moment ago, right? You have no prior experience of any kind, and you see one billiard ball streaking toward another. What are you supposed to think? Right, again, pure thought isn't going to reveal anything about causes or effects, and so pay attention to your senses. Do your senses reveal anything themselves about causes and effects? Hume puts it this way. He says, suppose, for example, that I see one billiard ball moving in a straight line towards another. Even if the contact between them should happen to suggest to me this idea of motion in the second ball, aren't there 100 different events that I can conceive might follow from that cause? May not both balls remain still? May not the first bounce straight back the way it came, or bounce off in some other direction? All these suppositions are consistent and conceivable. Why then should we prefer just one, which is no more consistent or conceivable than the rest? Our a priori reasonings will never reveal any basis for this preference. In short, every effect is a distinct event from its cause. So it can't be discovered in the cause, and the first invention or conception of it a priori must be wholly arbitrary. Right? Even after it has been suggested, the linking of it with the cause must still appear as arbitrary, because plenty of other possible effects must seem just as consistent and natural from reason's point of view. So there isn't the slightest hope of reaching any conclusions about causes and effects without the help of experience. That's why no reasonable scientist has ever claimed to know the ultimate cause of any natural process, or to show clearly and in detail what goes into the causing of any single effect in the universe. It is agreed that the most human reason can achieve is to make the principles that govern natural phenomena simpler, bringing in many particular effects together under a few general causes by reasoning from analogy, from experience, and from observation. But if we try to discover the causes of these general causes, we shall be wasting our labor. So a fairly lengthy quotation, but again, what Hume points out to us is something that if we pay attention ourselves, we can very well verify. That when you see, a thing that happened, a kind of idea that resembles cause and effect. So you see motion in the first billiard ball, you hear a click as they make contact, and you see motion in the second billiard ball. Is there any reason before that click happened that you should have expected what you see if you didn't have any prior experience? And even now that you do have prior experience, what do you really have experience of? You see motion, you see a click, and you see more motion, right? Or you hear the click rather. But is that click what causes or effects sound like, right? Is the motion in one ball or the other what causes look like or what effects look like? Again, do they have a smell, a taste? Clearly not. And so again, it's worth pointing out that not only does pure thought not tell us anything about causes or effects, but neither do our senses, at least not in any direct way. And so if we are going to maintain that our notion of cause and effect comes from experience, then we have to flesh that out. We have to have some bigger idea of what we're really talking about. And Hume, again, gives us a kind of proposal. Hume believes that it is a sort of fact about human nature that whenever we experience, one thing following another, or whenever we experience X following Y enough times, we come to expect that when we see Y, then we'll see X right after. And again, we do this by more or less automatic habit. And it's not just us, right? We also notice other kinds of animals have similar habits. If you do something, in particular enough times, even again, the lower animals come to expect it. When my alarm goes off in the morning, my cat expects that means he gets his food. And so, it's of course there's no real actual connection between those two things. I set the alarm so that I can wake up, right? I give him his food because he's my cat, and he needs to eat, and he's not going to really get it if I don't give it to him. And so this is certainly I do that after I wake up in the morning, but I don't give him the food literally because I wake up in the morning, right? It's simply one of those things where one comes after the other, but it's not because of the other. In fact, it's a very common fallacy to assume that when one thing follows another, that the first thing must have caused the second, and that's you can get into a lot of trouble. You can get a lot of things that are just terribly, terribly wrong if you confuse, as they say, correlation with causation. So, but we do certainly have this kind of habit. When we see something follow something else often enough, we just sort of come to expect it. It's almost as if we have no real choice in the matter, and it's yet one more operation that autopilot really is very, very good at. We just sort of make all these assumptions about what all that means and what causes what, based on our familiarity with one thing following another. So I mean, that's Hume's idea. That's Hume's idea of where we get this notion of cause and effect. He just sort of thinks that when we see things, as he puts it, constantly conjoined, that we just assume that there must be some reason for it, and then we sort of fill that reason in our heads. We sort of imagine it in some sense, because certainly our senses don't give it to us. So that means that cause and effect is certainly a kind from experience of a sort. But it's not directly from experience. Again, it's not something that we get through our senses. Instead, he thinks, again, there's this sort of habit going on. The real question is, once we decide to think that way, we need to know if our idea of cause and effect then, again, if this idea of cause and effect does arise due to habit, can it be justified? Right? Is that habit any good? Is it trustworthy? Does it tell us something real about the world? That is, our thoughts about the rules that by which we think the world works, is that real, or is it a kind of illusion? Very much like my cat believing that it's some kind of a natural law that as soon as my alarm goes off, he's soon to get his breakfast. Again, or thinking that the alarm, like, in some sense, causes his breakfast to appear somehow, which is very much not the case. It's a kind of coincidence. And so it will be the topic of the next lecture to to examine this question. And this question is what Hume examines in the second piece, the second part of his the excerpt from his Enquiry. He's going to say, in what sense can we justify all of our ideas about causes and effects, and what process can we use to justify it, and how good is that process of reasoning? But for now, it's enough to see a few things. Again, that there are two kinds of things to think about. There are relations, ideas, and matters of fact. That we have many beliefs about matters of fact that go beyond our senses, beyond our memory, and it seems only that this notion of cause and effect can accomplish that, and that we certainly get our idea of cause and effect from experience of a kind, but not directly from our senses. Instead, it appears to be a kind of conditioning that happens due to our experience, right? We just sort of see something happen often enough, we simply come to expect it. And if that's all it is, we want to know if it's justified, if our ideas about cause and effect are ultimately good ideas or ultimately not. And that's the question we'll pick up the next time we talk about David Hume's Enquiry concerning human understanding.